This is Join the Dots, the podcast about the impact of everyday choices for our health, wallets, and planet. Welcome to our new series, Demystifying Expertise. While making our regular podcast, we are connecting with experts in many fields, some familiar, some less so. In this series, we'll learn about what they do and how they see the world. In this episode, I'm joined by Tanya Rosen, who is currently in the Lesser Caucasus Mountains in Georgia. She is the conservation advisor at the Caucasus Nature Fund. Thank you for speaking to us, Tanya.
Thank you.
We'll come to your current job shortly, but I'd love to hear first from you a little bit about your career journey that has taken you from studying law in Harvard and then further in Yale and working in New York, then various Central Asian countries, and back to the mountains in Georgia. It seems to me almost like a fairy tale from urban centers to horseback in the plains of Central Asia, which excites me particularly because I am from Turkey and part of my family came from the Caucasus Mountains. So I was fighting with my co-hosts to be the person who interviews you. So I'm super excited to be talking to you. Tell me, how does one go from New York to Central Asia and where you are now?
Well, since I was a very little child, I always had this huge passion for wildlife, and especially for carnivores, and especially bears, brown bears. Part of my family is from mountain areas in the former Yugoslavia. And so growing up, I had a chance to spend a lot of time in nature and have a lot of time on my own exploring and occasionally running into wildlife. And that somehow must have influenced my soul and just my interest and attitude to life. And even though later a series of events, including the fact that my family was deeply affected by the war in the former Yugoslavia, then caused me to take a more practical attitude to life, and then embrace the idea of studying law and becoming an international lawyer with this idea of working for the UN and working as a hostage negotiator and resolving all the wars in the world. Mm-hmm. That love for nature always stayed with me. But then, for years, I did like many other people. I went to law school and then I did internships at the UN and then decided that it was important to study in the US. And so I managed to get a scholarship to study at Harvard. And I had actually already moved to the US to work for a law firm. And I was projected towards this idea of, working for a big law firm in New York to learn a lot of important skills that then I could eventually use as somebody working for the UN. Mm-hmm. But then in 2001, I had landed a really great job in a New York law firm. One day I was going to work and it was September 11, 2001, and there was the terrorist attack. Mm-hmm. And that whole event made me reconsider life and priorities. Life sometimes can be very unpredictable and could end from one moment to the other. Mm-hmm. And also that whole experience had left some significant trauma. That time in nature, and especially in Yellowstone, was actually helping me heal. I realized that I could not see myself any longer working as a corporate lawyer and not even working for the UN the way I originally conceived. And so I decided to do like a 360-degree change and decided that I wanted to become a wildlife biologist. I had no contacts, no friends, nobody that I could ask and talk to for advice. And so it was all just a series of research and asking people, and that process of asking and seeking advice to total strangers then led to the opportunity to then work as a volunteer field tech for a grizzly bear project in Yellowstone. And at the same time it was something that also allowed me to understand where I could get the education needed to truly become a wildlife biologist. And so kind of a new chapter started for me. And it was also when my daughter was born. So, this whole restart and rediscovery was particularly important, but also more challenged by the fact that I was a mother with a very young child. But a few years later, I met up with a colleague working in Pakistan who was telling me about some of the challenges that he was experiencing in dealing with human snow leopard conflicts. And so asked me for some advice and to help him with writing a proposal to access some additional funds for his work. And then he told me, well, but if I do get this grant, you have to come and, we'll put some, funding for your plane ticket. And I kind of laughed at the comment that he made, that we actually did get the grant. And so at that point, he was like, well, now you have to come to Pakistan. And going there, visiting these incredible communities in, Gilgit-Baltistan, which is the northern mountainous part of Pakistan, brought to light the fact that all of my, international background and training had a role to play even in this new phase of my life as a wildlife biologist. Around the same time, I had just gotten a job with the Wildlife Conservation Society, originally just to work on carnivore human-wildlife conflict issues in the Yellowstone region. But because everybody knew of my side project in Pakistan, I got quickly involved into this idea of creating developing a framework for transboundary conservation between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and China. And that quickly evolved into the proposal to go to Tajikistan to help organize a workshop and then set the basis for setting up of actually a conservation program in Tajikistan. And so I did go to Tajikistan thinking it would be just, 3-week-long trip. That was in 2011. And I ended up staying there. Being there didn't feel more strange or remote than working in Montana, because I was working on some of the species that I was really passionate about, and working with incredible people in the country and local young biologists, and in communities that had this incredible stories to share and to tell, and I felt at home. And so I stayed there. And originally my work was focused solely on Tajikistan, but then we expanded the reach of our work into Kyrgyzstan, working on the same issues, and very much working on helping local communities manage their own natural resources and their own wildlife, as a way of creating incentives for this wildlife to be protected by them and not to be exploited unsustainably or being poached. And so I did that for many years. Originally was with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and then later on was with another US-based organization called Panthera, where I worked until 2018. And then slowly the reach of my interests and work expanded. I realized that some of the work that we were doing in those two countries had also applications in neighboring countries. Working on snow leopards or working on Persian leopards, the challenges are very similar. So this is how at some point I started also making connections with colleagues in different countries across Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, in Turkmenistan, in Uzbekistan, and then in Iran and the Caucasus, where there's a number of leopards that have come from Iran that are struggling to establish themselves in the Caucasus, with the situation being obviously complicated by the usual problems of poaching, but compounded by the fact that there is conflict in the region that makes the movement of these leopards more complicated, and the collaboration and conservation efforts more complicated.
Gosh, I feel very humbled actually by all that story, because there is a lot of strife and difficulty with war and life-changing terrorism impact that you were in the middle of. But you're talking about them in a very positive light. I felt kind of embarrassed halfway through of your story, that I thought I shouldn't have maybe used the word fairy tale. But I'm really encouraged to see how you can turn it into positive work and make positive choices about your life.
Interesting thing is that when I kind of went down this road was to also in part to sort of cope with the trauma from what I had experienced in 2001. And I had this actually fairy tale idea that working with wildlife was this amazing, happy life. And while I have to say that there's many fairy tale moments still which happen thanks to the animals themselves when we see them or when we manage to achieve something that contributes to their conservation. And it also happens when, meeting and working with like-minded people. Sometimes I realize that it's a way more complicated and difficult life than I ever expected at so many levels. First of all, because I was under this sort of false expectation that everybody in this field is really driven by desire to protect species. There's also lots of people in this field that maybe they had the drive and the passion, but somehow they lost it on the way. And they're very cynical and they can be very brutal and territorial and very difficult to deal with. Then, I kind of thought of us as conservationists as kind of like the Red Cross, even though we might be working in complicated countries or conflict areas, that somehow because we are conservationists, everybody's going to see us as neutral. And that's absolutely not the case. We get caught into this horrible politics. And it happened to me in Tajikistan when, I was accused of being a spy and detained and harassed. And in Kyrgyzstan, we also had, not at that level, but now and then we had to deal with some questioning and so forth. And then, the biggest case was in Iran, which didn't happen to me personally, but it happened to my colleagues there who were, because of the complex relationships between Iran or the non-relationships between Iran and the United States and the fact that I was at that time working for an organization that had been established by a person who was politically very active in trying to promote regime change in Iran. Our colleagues in Iran got caught into all of this crazy politics and were arrested and jailed, and one of them died in prison, and the rest of the group to this date is still in jail. And these are people who are conservationists who have never had any history of, political activism. And the whole chapter, which is obviously still ongoing, has been a terrible surprise because I never thought that this could ever happen to biologists who are just caring about getting data and promoting policies for the conservation of wildlife.
Yeah, I'd read about this actually, but I was very surprised because when we, as sort of ordinary folk, hear about stories of conservation of carnivores and big cats and bears, we're just looking at through the camera's lens to the animals in the wild. We very rarely see any kind of political, economic, social conflicts that are going around in the area. But also, I would have thought for someone like you working in the field, the biggest risk would be to be kind of maybe attacked by the animals themselves or something. I never had thought about the political ramifications of what you're doing or misunderstandings or conditions you find yourself in without your control. I heard you speak at a National Geographic event. And I must say, you're also a National Geographic Explorer. I have to ask you afterwards how you come to be called that. In that one, you do also mention that you want to work with the local people, not just for the sort of economic benefits of protecting these species, but also just to experience observing the species as a therapy almost, as a way to forget your fears and trauma and experience. I thought that was very touching. Does that work? Does it convince them to help you implement your project?
It's a good question. Of course, when people are struggling to put food on the table for their children, they may not have the luxury of thinking of conserving the very wildlife that it's actually compromising their ability to put the food on the table. At the same time, having worked long enough and developed really close relationships with many people in different local communities across Central Asia, I see that especially, this past year has been very hard for a lot of the local communities because of many of the sources of income being lost. And even in the cases where, for example, trophy hunting is an option for, bringing income to communities, that hardly happened. And regardless, all of these people that I know have continued to protect the animals and find solace in their presence. And so that to me is uplifting and also confirmation that there is still, no matter what, nature and the wildlife and protecting them are important to the well-being of a human, no matter their background and their particular circumstances.
So can you tell us a little bit about why these species and also actually the people who share the nature with them in these mountainous areas, what kind of pressures are they under? Why are these species declining? And what kind of measures do you take to reverse that?
Yeah, so there's various threats affecting them. The biggest one, is related to loss of prey. Sometimes it's not just the animals that are. For example, the snow leopards, the Persian leopards that are necessarily killed, but it's the fact that the prey is being decimated, that leaves the leopards without a normal food base. And then adding to that is habitat loss and encroachment due to the fact that obviously a lot of people, for their needs and for general economic reasons, are relying and depending upon livestock. And as these numbers of livestock increase, that creates greater conflict. And then you have, because of the close contact between the livestock and the leopards, that's when you have the direct conflict and the depredations, which then local people, some of them obviously try to address by trapping the leopards and or killing them directly.
So what would be the natural food source for leopards?
It depends on the country, but generally is the ibex, which is this wild goat. And then there is the Argali sheep, which is a wild sheep. And then for the Persian leopard, you have the Bezar goat. And then you have the Urial sheep, which is, it's kind of a different subspecies of the ones that are found in parts of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan.
Are they sort of targeted by people, or they just don't have enough habitat?
They lose their habitat because of livestock, and that impacts the reproduction. And then they're killed by local people because their meat is very tasty, and there is no arguing about that. But when they are killed indiscriminately and without at least having a quota, at the very least, then the consequences for the population can be very detrimental.
Yeah, so the leopards that don't have enough natural prey then could attack livestock, and that triggers the humans in the area to see the leopard as the enemy.
And then, these are the most typical threats. And then compounding those threats, especially, in the case of Persian leopards, is the fact that then you have border fences. And some of the border fences that have been built around Turkmenistan and or in the Caucasus that, separate Armenia and Azerbaijan from Iran are fences that are quite, dense and hard for a leopard to cross, and not to mention for the prey. And so that limits the movement of the prey and of the leopard and limits their ability to expand.
So we kind of theoretically speak about environment knows no borders, nature knows no borders, so we should collaborate across nations. But actually here you have physical border problem where animals can't cross.
Yeah.
And it changes the way that they live and then therefore
exactly
what they do to survive.
In the Caucasus, then the additional problem is, because of the conflict, some of the borders are mined. So there's landmines
Mm.
essentially aimed to not kill people, but maim people. And so the result is that may not kill the wildlife, but they might maim the wildlife. And
Mm.
so there have been some leopards that looks like they might have stepped on landmines and still managed to survive. But obviously, we don't know for sure whether all of them survived and whether there's other leopards that maybe succumbed to the injuries and didn't make it. And so that's an additional stressor.
And so what kind of projects do you work on? What kind of measures you use to address these problems?
So currently in my role as conservation advisor for the Caucasus Nature Fund, my sort of mandate is to support the organization in their support of protected areas in Georgia and Armenia, and hopefully soon also in Azerbaijan. And so at the level of really equipping the protected areas with the resources to protect the areas well from poaching and from other disturbances. And it's a huge task because there's a great many challenges. And the first one being that typically rangers in general in Central Asia and in the Caucasus are not well paid. And the Caucasus Nature Fund supplements the salaries of rangers in Armenia and Azerbaijan in selected protected areas, which has already made a difference in terms of motivating the rangers to work well. But there's still a long way to go because there's still a lot of the rangers that don't have all the training that they need to do their job well. So, and adding to that is really also equipping the protected areas with the skills to monitor the wildlife, because otherwise we may not know what is the impact of the investments made in these protected areas if we don't see how that changes the status of some of the most iconic and most representative wildlife found in these areas. So that's my main job. But on the side, I'm still involved with some of the work in Central Asia and primarily in Turkmenistan, supporting a team there to through camera trapping increase our knowledge of presence, absence, and density of leopards. And so this is sort of an ongoing effort. And then also addressing the conflict hotspots so that we can...
conflict between the animals and the people.
Yeah, so that we can work with the communities and introduce some measures to reduce such conflict. And there's also this one incredible area that through camera trapping, we realize it's a very important leopard area that currently is not protected at all. The idea is to then prepare the justification for setting that area aside as a protected area. So that's one other piece of the work, and that also includes this issue of the border fences, because we've already seen that they have a huge impact on the movement of wildlife. And hopefully there will be means through working with the conventional migratory species and then also working with neighboring countries to hopefully come to some understanding and agreement as to how to, while obviously prioritizing national security, also to allow for the wildlife to use some gaps in the fence to move freely.
Oh, that's a really big portfolio, Tanya. I'm amazed you found some time to speak to me amongst all that job. Thank you so much again. But do you also work with parties like governments or international organizations at the very high level policy stuff as well? Because behind these individual conflict areas and behind the low wages of rangers, you have massive, large scale economic pressures, right? So do you provide information, inspiration for that higher level policymakers as well, so they work with you? Or do they just see conservation as like, oh, we'll just designate a few areas and then we can forget about that problem?
Yes, so we also work very closely with a number of international partners, and in terms of like conventions, obviously the Convention of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, CMS, plays a huge role, and it's a very easy convention to work with because they have a very deep understanding of sort of the work that we do on the ground. And so they take a lot of our input in their international policy making. And for example, one being the very creation of, it's called the Central Asian Mammals Initiative, which provides like the platform for the discussion of all threats facing a list of iconic species found in Central Asia, which obviously includes the snow leopard and Persian leopard and some of the key prey like the urial and the Argali sheep, the goiter gazelle. And so the specific issue of the fences is something that they are very, very keen on addressing. And because they have this power to obviously interact and influence, national policies, their role in actually finding some solutions will be crucial. And then I also have relations and contacts with people working in the ministries in several national governments who are very dedicated to resolving these pressing conservation issues. And of course, then there's also the donor community that plays also an important role because resolving some of these issues requires financial resources that foundations and governments through their development programs can help address.
You mentioned in passing about hunting trophies and ecotourism as well. And I wanted to ask you about them because some funding is great, but they tend to be time limited, right? You want to give a longer term sustainable source of income to the local people. And I know you work on that. Can you tell us a little bit about that income generating aspect?
First of all, I'm not a hunter.
Sure.
I don't like most of the trophy hunters. As people, I find them really, really strange. Sometimes you just have to leave your emotions aside and just think of what is good for the communities. And also think that, your values and the way you see wildlife may not be how the local people see the wildlife, and it may not be the motivation for them to protect the wildlife. And in some cases, really, there has to be a strong economic argument for them to protect the wildlife. And so that's where hunting comes into play. It's not the only tool, but it becomes one of the several income generating possibilities. And it has plus and minuses. And I would say the big minus is that because there's so much money involved, it attracts a lot of backlash within the country. And so it may attract other interests and people who then want to sort of seize the business and then want to destroy that community-based effort. And that is sometimes not so much the case with tourism, because tourism it just has a different economic value. It's obviously, there's not as much money coming in, but it's sort of a steady income that is enough for creating an argument for conservation.
Enough for the community and not too much to attract people from outside.
Yeah. And I've had even like people from some community-based conservancies tell me that they were so stressed by the whole trophy hunting that they were just happy to just deal with just focusing on tourism as a source of income rather than deal with the backlash, the political problems, with the hunting. So again, I think hunting has a role, but it has huge problems that tourism doesn't have. However, one of the advantages of trophy hunting is that trophy hunters do not require much. They just want to shoot an animal or pretend that they can shot an animal. They'll spend a lot of money and don't care about staying in a nice place. They just come, and it could be very rich people. You put them in a shelter with sleeping somewhere with bed bugs and they'll be fine. Which is kind of odd, but that's how they are. But with tourism is a different story, because if you want to attract some tourism that is going to actually bring some reasonable income, you need to create some infrastructure. And that, generates its own issues and concerns, because you don't want to create infrastructure that then has a negative footprint on the environment. And that has still not been the case in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, because the level of tourism there is still somewhat limited. But I've seen it like in the Caucasus, in Georgia, with Georgia being extremely popular as a tourism destination, and seeing, beautiful places trashed. And it really hurts to see, trash everywhere, or see suddenly all these incentives for, building horrible hotels and facilities just to get people. And so I really wish that in the future, there is a way, especially now after, we're still in the pandemic, and the fact that obviously people go on vacation, they will prefer to go in places where there's not that many people. I hope that at least provides an incentive for like changing how people experience places, and then hopefully that might lead to promoting some form of different options of like more responsible and truly like ecotourism. I have a friend in the UK who is a journalist, and also she organizes trips in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and she was talking about how she's getting feedback from people saying that they want to experience places in a more sort of authentic way, which would be good for the nature and the wildlife.
Yes, I hope we're learning something from this pandemic. But I want to ask a more positive question to you. What keeps you going?
It's the animals and the wildcats and the leopards. I almost have kind of a religious attachment to this animal. I cannot quite explain in a logical way. People make fun of me a great deal, but at times when I ask myself, why am I doing this? Why am I subjecting myself to this, and that, when I could be just, doing something else, and being at home with my animals, and then just living a happy, more stress-free life. Always one of my animals that I study that sort of shows up and just tells me, no, you're supposed to stay here and help us. It's amazing. It happens every single time. I mean, not that often, but happens often enough that, I feel like I have to do the best I can until maybe for the rest of my life, but for sure, at least until the moment where I feel like other people can do that. And, which is actually the case in some of the countries where I work less, because I have amazing colleagues who have basically taken up upon themselves to do the same work. But yeah, these animals bring so much life and joy and meaning to my life that that's enough for me to just endure the sort of the negative sides of this work.
I'm a little lost for words, Tanya. The way you're explaining this kind of spiritual elements to your work is really moving me. Thank you so much for sharing that. Are there things that you learned in your work? And I think maybe this spiritual connection is one. Is there anything that you learned in your work that you think would be helpful for others working in any aspect of environment?
I would like to say that, thanks to these animals, I've learned so much about peoples and countries that have often a very negative reputation, or that are viewed in a certain like superficial way. And so I'm grateful to that incredibly. And I use every opportunity that I have to sort of bring out this other stories of these countries and these people. But I also wanted to say that I wish that sort of the world of politicians, US or Europe, would really also sort of do the same, because I feel like that if they had this deeper knowledge of the lives and the struggles of people in these countries, it would positively affect their international negotiations and policymaking.
Bit more respect and understanding, I think you're
Yes.
calling for, isn't it? Before we make judgments about who the other people are,
Yeah.
maybe stop and learn and put ourselves in their shoes as much as possible, although that's quite a difficult thing to do. Is there anything that you'd like to say to sort of end and leave our listeners with?
Well, to be curious about leopards in the countries they live in, because of the countries that these leopards live in are spectacular and complex, and I hope more people can take time and interest in discovering them.
I will ask you for some links
Yeah.
to these countries and the project and the things that you'd like us to learn. We'll put them on our website and spread the word as much as we can. Thank you so much for making time for us and joining us in Join the Doors.
You're more than welcome.
Do you have this effect on everybody, or is this a very emotional day for me? I don't know.
Well, I do get emotional when I talk about leopards.
Say hi to all your lovely animals from me.
I will. Thank you. It was really wonderful to talk to you.
Thanks for listening. And thanks to the rest of the team, Tara Uyghur on podcast production and Neil McEwen on sound and music. If you enjoyed this, look out for our upcoming episodes and all other info on our website jointhedotspodcast.com.